Now this is the Mark IV tank of 1917, and it's really the first mass-produced tank in the world. We built about 1,200 of them back to almost to the end of 1918 by the time we finished, and they were built all over the country. The Mark IV is mechanically the same as the Mark I. It's got the same Daimler engine inside, the same gearbox and the same transmission, so it still requires 4 men to drive it, plus 2 acting as gunner and loader on each side in a mail tank. Now, there are differences. For a start, the armour is a bit thicker on the Mark IV than it is on the Mark I, not really so as you notice, but enough to keep anti-tank bullets out. The other thing is the sponsons have been modified. You can now push the sponson inboard for rail travel. With the Mark I, if you had to go anywhere by rail, you had to unbolt the sponson and lift it off, and that caused all kinds of problems. So they made the sponson here push inwards. You'll also notice that the guns on this tank are shorter. They're 23 calibers long instead of 40 calibers long. They found that the longer guns were unnecessary. They kept bashing into things and burying themselves in the ground, so they decided to go for shorter guns. It doesn't make any difference as far as the tank's concerned. It still dished out a reasonable amount of firepower. The gun trains for about 90 degrees, from on the beam to dead ahead, but the sponsons, if you can look at both of them at the same time, which is very difficult, they're not actually mirror image of one another. There are slight differences, and that's because the gunner and the loader always had to stand in exactly the same place relative to the gun in either side, and there's a risk of the chap being squashed flat if he was on the wrong side. So that's a slight difference. The other big difference with the Mark IV is the fuel. On the Mark I, you had 2 25-gallon tanks up in the nose of the tank, and it wasn't either a very good place, either it's not very convenient for filling, and it was a terrible threat if the tank was hit, because the tank just blew up at once. On the Mark IV, the petrol is outside in a container between the rear horns. There's no tail, so you can fill up the gap in the back there quite easily. And it takes 70 gallons of petrol. It's in an armoured container, so that it can't be penetrated by shells, and it's low down beneath the sort of firing line of anyone shooting at it. And in those days, petrol was sucked into the tank by a device known as an autovac, and then it trickled down into the engine. So the actual feed was quite good. It worked quite well. But also you've got 70 gallons and this one against 50 in there. And since the tank could do, or shall we say, roughly half a mile to a gallon, that extra 20 gallons made quite a difference, meant the tank could do a bit of decent cross-country running. They were most famous for their participation in the Battle of Cambrai, which was in November of 1917, and it meant that about 300, 400 tanks were launched against the Germans, and they actually blew a great big hole in the German line. They were fitted with a fascine device on top of the cab there, which you could tip into trenches and use as a stepping stone to climb over the trenches, but they were only ever used at Cambrai. So if you see a tank with a fascine on, it must be taking part in the Cambrai action somewhere along the line. They normally also have unditching beam rails on top with a beam for getting them out of the mud. You chain that to the tracks. This one hasn't got those. It was actually only ever a training tank in Britain, as far as we know, so it didn't have all these fittings added to it at the time. But it is still in working order, and I've actually driven it. The trouble is, like all the early tanks, it has no suspension at all. It's just rollers running on the tracks themselves, so it clatters and bangs along the ground. It's very uncomfortable, but you can more or less get along in it, and the people at the front at least have somewhere to sit again. Everybody else is standing or crouching at the guns and all over the place, and the engine's right in the middle, making a terrific noise and giving off loads of fumes. The actual conditions inside are vile, and you wonder how the people stood it, but they did, because they were a lot safer in there than they were wandering about in the trenches.